Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Paul Snowgrove. I'm the Associate Scientific Director of the Ocean Frontier Institute and a professor at Memorial University. I want to recognize that the Ocean Frontier Institute's physical offices are located on ancestral and traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups in Atlantic Canada. Our institute is working hard to advance respectful and meaningful partnerships with Indigenous peoples. Welcome to the Ocean Frontier Institute's Social Science and Humanities Working Group, People and the Ocean Speaker Series. This is the third of 8 webinars this year featuring international experts who seek to understand complex interactions between society, economy, culture, and marine and coastal environments. Thank you all for coming, and my sincere thanks to the working group for organizing this impressive series. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Paul Foley from Memorial University's Grenfell campus for he's very much a valued member of OFI's Social Science and Humanities Science Group, and he's going to introduce today's speaker and discussants and to moderate today's session. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. It's my great pleasure to introduce the 2 panelists and the 2 discussants for today. But before I do that, I'd like to just say a few words about how this event is organized. Our panelists will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by a short presentation by our 2 discussants, who will each respond for about 5 minutes. And we'll have about 10 minutes for the panelists and discussants to respond to each other. After that, we'll have about 30 minutes for all of us to join in a Q&A session with questions for presenters and discussants. And please feel free to start putting questions in the Q&A box during the presentation. I'd also like to call your attention to a couple of important do's and don'ts about the Q&A session. So first, please do not use the chat box. We will only be using the Q&A box to read, respond, and present questions from the audience. And we want everyone's focus to be on the panelists and the discussants, so please just use the Q&A box. Second, when writing a question or comment, please keep it brief. And third, please remember to keep your mics muted. And now it's my pleasure to introduce first our presenters, Dr. Melissa Marsk and Dr. Peter van der Geest. Melissa Marsk is a professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Her work focuses on livelihoods, natural resources, and precarious work, with a particular interest in migrant workers in industrial fisheries. Peter van der Geest is Professor Emeritus of Geography at York University. His current research concerns working conditions and labor relations for migrant workers in industrial fisheries, with a focus on fisheries operated from Thailand and Taiwan. His approach to this research builds on his past work on the political ecology of forestry, agriculture, and aquaculture in Southeast Asia. And just to note that Peter is joining us from a remote location with potential connection challenges, so Melissa will be handling the presentation and Peter will be potentially joining us for the Q&A session. Our 2 discussants are Dr. Desai Shan and Dr. Barb Neese. Dr. Desai Shan is Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Medicine, Memorial University of Newfoundland. She received her PhD from Cardiff University in 2017. She has held an Ocean Frontier Institute postdoctoral fellowship, an On the Move Research Partnership postdoctoral fellowship, and a Nippon Foundation Seafarers International Center PhD fellowship. As a dedicated researcher in the fields of international maritime law and occupational health and safety, she has published 15 research articles and book chapters on Canadian and international seafarers' rights to occupational health and safety. Barb Neese is John Lewis Patton Distinguished University Professor and Honorary Research Professor at the Department of Sociology of Memorial University of Newfoundland. She is also the former co-founder and co-director of the Safety Net Center for Occupational Health and Safety Research, and a member of the Scientific Committee of the Council of Canadian Academies. Professor Neese has worked for 3 decades in multidisciplinary research teams carrying out community-engaged research in marine and coastal contexts on social and environmental change, rebuilding fisheries, gender and fisheries, occupational health and safety, and mobile work. She is also a co-investigator in several modules and projects of the Ocean Frontier Institute. Melissa, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. I will share my screen. So thank you very much, the Ocean Frontier Institute, for the opportunity for us to give this presentation. Peter and I worked on this together. It's part of a collective project called Work at Sea that we do with other faculty members at York University, at UNC in the United States, and a whole series of postdocs and graduate students. Also, thank you for Paul for moderating, and I'm really welcoming the chance to hear the discussant comments on this work. So thank you for your thoughtful thinking around this. So our project called Work at Sea began in 2020, just as the pandemic hit. And originally we were slated for a lot of field work, mainly focusing on Taiwanese and Thai fisheries. And we realized that we would very much need to pivot given COVID. And so we have shifted our focus to really think about the new problems that the pandemic has created for migrant fish workers in industrial fishing. But also to think about what COVID reveals about an already existing marginalization for seafarers in fishing. And so we've been thinking both about the details of what fish workers are experiencing, but also a broader framing. The way we'll do this, I guess I will do this presentation, but on our behalf will be in 3 parts. I'll just give a brief overview of distant water fisheries and migrant crew to give you a context of what has already been happening pre-COVID, and then shift into findings from a recently published paper that looked at seafarers and fishing based on research we actually did in the winter spring of 2021, so very recently. And then I'll go into a political economy of marginalization, thinking about some of the reasons why we think fish workers in particular continue to be marginalized. And at the very end, I'll do a little pivot to Canada because we also have challenges in our fisheries, and we'll speak a little bit about that, particularly for migrant workers. So to start with an overview, part 1 of migrant crew on distant water fisheries, what's really critical to realize is that industrial fish work or distant water fisheries have exploded in recent years. And so we're talking about boats that really move around the world to fish and that scoop up large amount of fish that ends up being flash frozen and eventually either canned, sold as fresh fish, or exported globally. And so this is sort of a more recent emergence, and China in particular has had a huge rise in the past decade, and Chinese fleets are now the largest in the world. So Chinese fleets are huge, but China is not the only big fleet. Taiwan has many vessels, and so does South Korea, Japan, and Spain. What's important to realize is just how far these fishing fleets travel. And since our port of departure has always been Taiwan, we started mapping out some of the vessels Taiwanese vessels, where we had already spoken to workers. We were quite fortunate that Peter and I were able to do some research just before the pandemic hit. But then one of our grad students, a co-author on our paper, Mallory, she actually was able to spend 6 months in Taiwan before Taiwan ended up shutting down again this spring, but she was able to have this sort of 6 or 8 month window and was able to speak with workers. I'll just point out, these are 3 different types of boats you see on this map, thanks to one of our postdocs for mapping it. We see squid jiggers, longliners, and purse seiners. And I'll point out to the red, which is the squid jiggers, just to explain a little bit about the routes and to understand why we're thinking about fish workers, but also why we've turned our attention to global ports. So for the squid jiggers typically leave Taiwan, the port of Kaohsiung, in December or January. They head for the Falkland Islands, most likely stopping over Cape Town. That takes about 40 days. They stay there for 3 or 4 months, so until May or so. Then they return to Taiwan, again, 40 more days of travel, maybe with a stop for fuel in South Africa. Back up into Taiwan, they shift gear once they're back in Taiwan and then they head off to Japan for fishing sauri. And sauri is a mackerel-like species that's really loved in East Asia. And so once they head off to these waters, take 7 or 8 days, they will spend another 6 months before again returning to Taiwan to offload. And so what this tells you is that fish workers are out on boats for long periods of time. 6 months is nothing, and access to port really matters on the moments that they can access port. Now, who are these workers? We know that the workers are mostly transnational migrant workers. They're mainly coming from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. We can say that with certainty in terms of the Taiwanese fleet. In terms of the Chinese fleet, we know less, although we definitely know that Indonesian and Filipino workers are on those boats. We know that on the Korean fleets, there's a huge number of Indonesian workers, and we're hearing for boats that end up traveling through Cape Town and up into sort of West African waters in the Atlantic, there's West African workers as well. Workers are actually getting to the job in a variety of ways. Because of how migrant work emerges, you have to travel by air or by boat. You can't just get there. So unlike other fisheries where there's mobility in a region, we saw that in Thailand, where you had a lot of Thai boats were always with migrant workers from Myanmar or from Cambodia, and they could cross the border, but in a bit more of a fluid way because the border was a land crossing. In the case of getting onto Taiwanese boats, you have to either go by boat or you have to fly. And so many workers may come to port in Taiwan. They might be flown there, or they might be flown down to another port elsewhere. So we heard many cases of workers being picked up in Singapore or in South Africa in Cape Town. And again, that's because it's less costly to have a migrant worker start their journey kind of partway through if you're going to a fishing ground really far away than the entire time. So this mobility that I'm talking about, of course, becomes a huge issue during COVID, which is what I'll get into in a second. I want to emphasize we're talking about migrant workers in Taiwan, and I'm about to get into the challenges that migrant workers have faced during COVID, mainly on Taiwanese boats, but not only. And we saw that much more is needed. We need to understand much more about workers on Chinese boats in particular. But we've seen labor challenges in New Zealand in already 2011-12 with Indonesian workers on Korean boats in New Zealand waters. Thailand had a huge labor scandal in 2014, which included examples of human trafficking, and it really exposed the completely unacceptable working conditions that workers faced on this fishery. Thailand has since done a lot of work to clean this up. And now I think the attention is really turning to kind of industrial fisheries, and perhaps the worst examples may be on the Chinese fleets, although this is sort of based on our initial discussions at port. And we certainly heard challenges on the Taiwanese boats. So let me get into that. So our paper entitled Seafarers, a Year into the Pandemic, really came about because we started interviewing, actually we just started interviewing folks in January, February, mainly in North America and Europe, just trying to get a sense of what was going on during COVID. We'd been following the news really closely. We'd gathered a lot of news articles and NGO reports, but we wanted to talk to international organizations to see what they were doing to help migrant fish workers. And we had one interview where we were actually quoted back one of our earlier papers, and it made us realize that we needed to talk. I apologize, we're having some connectivity issues with my colleague. I don't know if you can hear that going through. So what we did was, after talking with folks in Europe, we realized we needed to start talking with people in the field that actually knew what was going on. And one of the comments we were, or notes we were given, was that it was really important to talk with port chaplains, so faith-based organizations. And here's Stella Maris has a really strong network globally and are quite dedicated to supporting seafarers. So what we did is we started contacting these chaplains, and you can see on the map in green are the different ports where we spoke. And it was in countries such as Uruguay and Taiwan and Mauritius and Seychelles and Cape Town. And at the same time, we spoke with organizations in Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, that were advocacy organizations, particularly trying to support people during the pandemic. So this sort of is a slide on research methods to give you a sense of who we actually spoke with. I will say, perhaps because of the lockdown and because people had time, people were very generous in speaking with us, which was a really special experience and gave me a lot of hope in terms of what we were hearing particular organizations being able to do in terms of supporting fish workers. At the same time, it became really clear that there was serious issues for fish workers that were maybe worse than other seafarers were facing. You know, the headlines in the news, the New York Times talked about seafarers stuck at sea. We heard about it initially in cruise. We saw the Evergreen or the Ever Given that was stuck in the Suez Canal in terms of cargo, and in that case it was Indian seafarers that were with that boat. So certainly seafaring made the news, but fish work rarely made the news, and we were really hearing some pressing issues. So crew change and repatriation was one issue, and the second was shore access. So let me start with crew change and repatriation. In general, when seafarers reach the end of a contract, a fishing company is supposed to arrange for the pay and travel for their trip home. But fishing companies have subcontracted that work to where migrant workers are coming from. So, for example, a company in the Philippines or in Indonesia. And so migrant workers are getting their contracts in Indonesia or the Philippines and then are getting on boats. So when it came time to go home, it's the actual, usually it's not the fishing company, but it's actually where your contract was originally signed. So it gets really muddled in terms of who has ownership of getting you home. And this is at the best of times, never mind in COVID. So the pandemic has made crew change really difficult. Many workers who are at the end of their contracts became stuck in port. Policies also varied widely in port, adding to this challenges. So some countries, I think South Africa and Singapore, even in Canada, we had general provisions for seafarers, declaring them as essential workers, so allowing some form of mobility. But in other countries who were very concerned about COVID spreading, we're taking a hard line on crew change and shutting ports down completely. So we saw this in South Pacific countries, in China and in Mauritius. So another challenge for crew change is is that it's made difficult by a lack of international flights. The whole travel industry was slammed, so that's no different for fish workers. And while what we heard was European fleets were able to charter private flights to get crew back and forth, this was not happening in the case of the Asian fleets, at least what we know of. Even when crew change was permitted, quarantine became an issue. Quarantine requirements are constantly shifting. We're seeing that here in Canada right now as the Omicron variant emerges. And so it was an ever shifting space, and these workers were often at sea for a long period of time, would come into port, and the rules would shift, and they might either be stuck on the boat or they were stuck at port. So we heard of one case in Cape Town, for example, where it was time for crew change, and as new crew were coming in, this was Filipino crew, and it was just as COVID had really hit the Philippines, a plane load of crew would come in. If one person was infected of that crew, they would all be sent back. And so this happened 4 times, where 4 different plane loads of potential crew were coming in. They would test, one case of COVID would emerge, and the entire plane load had to turn around and go back. And so it was really hard for shipping companies to get crew. It was hard for crew to get to their work. And another thing we heard about was consolidation of crew. So if 3 boats were struggling with crew, you would consolidate crew and a boat would go out. Now, this maybe seems ideal from a management perspective. This meant that workers who might have been of one nationality, might have known each other, had worked together for a while, were split up. And so you might have multiple nationalities on boats. This could lead to conflicts. Some might be more exhausted than others. For families back home that didn't know that their loved ones had shifted boats, they suddenly weren't able to follow them on crew tracking apps. And so it just led to a lot of uncertainty and chaos. The other thing that happened in terms of crew change and repatriation is that captains really pressured men to extend. Sorry, fish workers are mainly male. There's a very masculine space on these boats. They were getting a lot of pressure to extend their contracts, and so usually fishing contracts might be done by 12 or 18 months. And so you would be at the end of your contract. You've already been at sea. If you think back to that map I showed of the fishing route for the squid going back and forth, you've only seen port 3 or 4 times in a year. So you've been on that boat the entire time. Pressure to extend contracts was real, and some felt they had no choice but to say yes, because if not, they would lose work. Some told us that they had to say yes simply because there was no way to get home. So there was no choice. They had to keep working. This is an example from the Stella Maris newsletter. Stella Maris, as I mentioned, was one of our important contacts. And in South Africa and Cape Town, they keep a newsletter every month. And so kind of updating what they've been doing. So here it says 11 Filipino crew on the Chinese vessel had finished work for 3 years. So can you imagine, we only heard of 3-year contracts on Chinese boats. On Taiwanese boats, they're shorter, and other boats we heard they're shorter. So they'd worked for 3 years. A new captain flew into Cape Town to ask the men to extend their contracts for yet another year. They refused, saying that 3 years of hard work was enough. It was too much. And they were, at that point, told by the crewing agencies, who were also putting pressure on them, that they would have to pay their own flight home. So we don't know how the case was resolved, but although we can see from vessel tracking apps that the vessel actually left Cape Town in May. Something that chaplains emphasized across ports in all cases was that workers needed to go home at the end of the contracts. They were exhausted physically, but also mentally. They had rarely been in contact with their loved ones. They'd endured long working hours. Keep in mind that work in fishing at any point is long and arduous. When you're actually hauling fish, it can be 18 to 20 hours a day. Quarters are confined and tight. Workers have often told us that the food they're eating is minimal at best, particularly when they're out at sea for long periods of time. So a lot of fish bits and rice, but vegetables are often lacking. Dietary considerations are not necessarily taken into account. Sleep is difficult. There's a consistent, persistent noise on the boat. Septic and bathroom can fail. Never mind the violence and the coercion and the pressure that captains might exude on crew to meet quota demands. So this is difficult work, and the end of the contract and getting paid is a really important thing for fish workers. So turning to the next point that we found, another major issue was shore access. At many points in the pandemic, ports were refusing anyone to leave the boat. And so can you imagine being at port, but not being able to leave your boat? In Singapore, one of our interviewees told us of trying to increase their Wi-Fi range to simply ensure workers could at least communicate with families while being stuck on the boat, since they couldn't leave. If you can't leave the boat, you're not accessing shore services, and they're so critical for workers. This is when of course, I mentioned communication with family. This becomes critical. It's been months at a time that you haven't talked to anyone. You don't know, especially with COVID circulating, the stress of where it's circulating. Is someone sick? Has a family member died? It's grim to not be in touch. And so access to shore and Wi-Fi is super important. Medical care, fishing is dangerous at the best of times. Hooks can go in throats. Fingers can be blunted. It's intense. And so having those kind of ailments treated once at shore becomes really important for general health and long-term health as well. Religious services are really important, mosques, churches, talking to port chaplains, that becomes quite important, along with seafarer support organizations. There are NGOs that will be working with migrant workers. There's diaspora community, so getting a home-cooked meal by, for example, some of the Filipino community in Montevideo or in Cape Town makes a huge difference. And then just the right to recreation and having a little break after all that time on the water. So there's many reasons that you need access to port. And of course, the most important reason is if you're with a captain that's abusive, you need to get off that boat. And so if you can't access shore, it's a huge, huge challenge for workers. This is an example of a sign that was put up in Taiwan. You're entering a COVID-19 control area, no docking without permission. We found in our discussions that some ports seem to encourage shore access more. And so we mentioned Taiwan and Cape Town and the Seychelles, and other places were quite strict about not allowing port access. If we understand properly, none of the migrant workers could ever access shore if they were on a Chinese boat returning to China in terms of crew change. It was always done via the boat, but never on land. So there's some more intricacies to figure out. Unfortunately, we heard of cases where workers were critically ill and they were not able to leave the boat. We don't know how often this happened, but we were told by an interviewee about a boat being at a port in Mauritius at a time when Mauritius was having a strict ban on anyone accessing port, and the crew was refused medical care and had to go on to the Seychelles. They went, for one of the crew, it was too late, they died in Seychelles. A few others were treated. We also just heard more generally about medications running out for chronic conditions like diabetes or hypertension, which seems to be common among fish workers. Injuries, the cuts and the strains that I mentioned were untreated. And of course, mental health was severely affected. So in sum, what this research really has taught us is that ports really matter. They matter immensely, as do the support organizations that are at ports, and that constellation of actors make the difference of whether people can be helped or not. Even in a case where access might not be allowed at port, you know, the difference of getting access to Wi-Fi because somebody figures out how to do that. Or in the case of illness, there's advocacy organization forcing states that have signed on to the MLC to insist on particular rights of fish workers, of seafarers in general, for example. Local unions, local churches, advocacy. Often if someone was really ill, some of the best ways that we heard of where people actually got treatment was when folks back home in the Philippines or Indonesia, along with organizations, started petitions. It hit the news, a huge advocacy push. Consular services were forced to intervene, and that was one way some workers were able to get care or even get repatriated. So ports matter, as do the people that are working in and around that constellation. Okay, so I guess one of the things we started thinking about then is, why are fish workers in particular so marginalized? We know seafarers are generally, but we argue it seems like fish workers have it really bad. And that's what we heard consistently by port chaplains who are working with seafarers in general. And part of it probably comes down to slightly different policy at play. The Marine Labor Convention, which has been ratified by most coastal states, and it covers everybody but military and fish workers. And so fish workers have a separate convention. It's called Work and Fishing, C188. It's not widely ratified, 19 countries. And it's relatively weak in terms of the provisions. It's almost like this add-on. It's not nearly as strong. So we saw that just even in terms of crew change and repatriation. One huge thing is that the MLC says there's a maximum duration at time at sea, which is around 11 months. There's nothing in C188. And there's obligations to ensure that crew actually are repatriated. So that makes a huge difference. Also in terms of shore access, only for medical treatment or serious injury would C188 insist on that, whereas MLC goes through far more provisions of why seafarers need to have access to shore and what that would include. So as we think about a political economy of marginalization, I will flip forward to my notes. We argue that we're starting to set out a framework for some of the reasons why we think fish workers are so marginalized. Part of it is being excluded from the Marine Labor Convention. We're not suggesting that ILO is not important and C188 is, and if it was ratified more widely, of course, that would make a difference. But it's a starting point and policy has to continue getting stronger. We also noted that in key organizations that were responsible for overseeing 188 and MLC, much more effort has gone towards seafarers on cargo or in tourism than it has in fish work. And so we heard that consistently. Another challenge is that fishing companies tend to be small, they're dispersed, they lack resources. There's not that consolidation that you see in the shipping sector. And there hasn't been the resources, for example, to fly crew on and off or things such as that. Many fishing companies just don't have the global reach. There's almost no unionization in fish work. Unionization rates tend to be an indicator of how seafarers in fishing are organizationally marginalized. And so the fact that there's limited unionization speaks volumes. There's a much higher rate of unionization in cargo, for example. We also saw that often fishing ports are actually separate from cargo ports. And so the two worlds are not always kind of interacting. There's also other characteristics, though, that contribute to such marginalization. Workers in fishing are out at sea for a much longer time. They don't necessarily speak English and don't necessarily have the language that they're able to speak with captains. There's no provision at this point to access port consistently, and so that's a big struggle. And often public authorities are understanding workers in fishing to be a potential source of infection. And so you have this thing where workers are not encouraged to leave the boat because they might infect others. And on the flip side, it could be captains or companies saying, don't leave the boat because they're worried about a worker picking up COVID, and it is so difficult to handle crew change and to consistently keep working these boats at this moment. So it's a combination of seaports as border crossings and anti-migrant worker racism that has sometimes led to extreme policies, which has really restricted the movement of migrant workers while at port. So where does Canada fit in all of this? We've done some work in Canada, mostly in seafood processing plants and thinking about our temporary foreign worker program. We have not, we don't know much about laborers or workers that are actually in fishing. So that's an area that requires greater research. We do know that in seafood processing, even before COVID, workers were having huge challenges in terms of having to pay to get a job through the temporary foreign worker or paying to change jobs. So we have a stark area there. It's illegal to pay for a job. That workers have inadequate housing, there's varied working hours, there's examples of places where workers are having to pay for things like gloves or PPE. And so during COVID, we started hearing more about enhanced shutdowns. We know that China is a huge source for our lobster and crab. And the Chinese market shut down in 2020, whereas it opened up vigorously in 2021 because the vaccine had been rolled out. So there's been these huge pandemic fluctuations in terms of the seafood market. And of course, workers have been affected with plants shutting down at some point, workers not being able to get home, and then plants starting up again. There's a couple of other areas I'd argue that Canada has not paid a lot of attention to and ought to. We haven't signed on to C188, and I know I've been critical of it, but it still forces particular obligations in terms of fish workers. And so I'm not clear why we haven't signed on, but that strikes me as an obvious thing to move towards. We also don't have a Modern Slavery Act. And so we don't, the UK has a Modern Slavery Act where companies have to declare their supply chains are free of modern slavery. The US has California has a Supply Chain Transparency Act. Advocates in this space are saying what would be really great if Canada could follow the French model and do something like due diligence, which would really not only force companies to think about their supply chains, but also would give workers that were in unjust conditions a chance to actually sue. So it's a bit of a broader piece of policy. So to summarize, we're arguing that the pandemic really heightens or further reveals issues about marginalization of migrant workers in distant water fisheries, but of course, more broadly throughout the supply chain. Had the pandemic not happened, I don't know if we would have started thinking as carefully about global ports. We really had always been doing field-based research kind of, in Taiwan or in Thailand or in sending countries like Cambodia or Indonesia or the Philippines. But the port piece became really important as we started seeing where workers actually stopped in briefly, even if it was a 5-day stint in Cape Town or in Montevideo or in Seychelles, and why those ports of significant matter so much. And so that piece has been a really important insight. On the other hand, we really need to spend time in these ports now to really verify what's going on and to better understand how this constellation of actors is working and the best ways to actually support seafarers. And so I think that's our longer term goal. Finally, to end, I know this presentation has been about problems in fish work, and it's quite distressing and depressing that this continues, but I do want to end with some optimism. I've been impressed with the dedication of folks at ports. They do tremendous work and can make a huge difference. I think there is a growing awareness of the marginalization of migrant workers, not just in fish work, but more broadly. And this is a moment to seize. I think there's increased interest in unions to support workers, which is really important, and a greater number of seafarer support centers. And so I really look forward to hearing the comments of the two discussants, and I welcome hearing your thoughts on this and any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and just over to Barb in a moment. But in the meantime, just to encourage people, if you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. So if they're fresh for Melissa, dump them in the Q&A for now. Over to you, Barb.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. Thank you very much, Melissa, and Peter, silent in the background, but I'm sure has lots of thoughts. I appreciate the opportunity to learn about your most recent work on COVID-19 and international migrant fishery workers employed in distant water fleets. And I entirely agree that the importance of this work is not only what it tells us about the particular COVID-related vulnerabilities of these workers, but also what it tells us about how these vulnerabilities are linked to what you call in the paper multiple and complex modes of marginalization experienced by many seafarers, but particularly by internationally migrant fishery workers on an ongoing basis. I also appreciated the brief discussion of COVID-19 related vulnerabilities among temporary foreign workers employed in fish processing in Atlantic Canada, and I'm going to focus my comments more on the Canadian context. As part of our work in Module I of the Ocean Frontier Institute, we have a project on fishing safety, and a piece of that project has involved examining response to COVID-19 in small-scale fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. It's worth contrasting briefly what happened in this case to the experience of the fishery workers in this presentation. The Newfoundland and Labrador small-scale harvesters and crew are unionized, and safety initiatives in the fishery are supported by the work of the Newfoundland and Labrador Fish Harvesting Safety Association. The COVID pandemic was declared in March 2020 on the eve of the opening of the small-scale fisheries, employing almost 10,000 harvesters in hundreds of communities, plus processing workers. To make a long story short, rapid and active intervention by the leaders of these organizations, the union and the Fish Harvesting Safety Association, and the support of relevant public health and safety agencies led to a relatively short delay in the opening of these fisheries to allow for the co-development of COVID safe work practice guidelines. These, coupled with other factors, allowed these fisheries to proceed with some but limited disruption to the lives of many in small-scale fisheries and fishing communities, and in the absence of documented infections and outbreaks. The contrast is striking. In addition, I'm the project director for the On the Move Partnership, a national program of research examining extended mobility for work within and into Canada and its consequences for workers and their families, employers, and communities. Drawing mainly on media coverage and emerging research, we've assembled over the past 1.5 years a working paper on COVID-19 and what we call the mobile labor force that is freely available on our website. We've argued that the mobile labor force, which includes fishery workers and seafarers, has been particularly affected by COVID-19 because for the most part, their work cannot be done from home and in many cases has been deemed essential. And what that analysis shows is the particular vulnerabilities of temporary foreign workers, and in the Canadian context, interjurisdictional rotational workers, those who live in one province or territory and work in another, to health risks, marginalization, and significant disruptions in their work and family lives and mobility in the context of COVID. To varying degrees, both types of workers have found themselves immobilized in their home jurisdiction and unable to go to work as originally scheduled, particularly international workers, and immobilized at work once they arrive, unable for a variety of reasons to visit communities, to access services, and to, in some cases, return home when they might want to. As the pandemic unfolded, the Canadian and provincial governments gradually became aware of these mobile workers and the challenges of policy framework based largely on immobilizing people at home and in their communities created for them. Canada initially closed its borders to international workers who were not Canadian citizens. Faced with pressure from trucking companies, agricultural operations, seafood processors, and others, federal policies were eventually put in place to allow the entry of temporary foreign workers, although some provinces, such as New Brunswick, continued to block their entry for some time. Strict quarantine requirements were put in place for temporary foreign workers with federal funding to cover the cost of wages during quarantine. But workers were not necessarily always paid unless attention was paid to conditions at work after quarantine that might make them sick, continuing a widespread neglect of temporary foreign worker health and safety, housing, and other conditions well documented in the existing literature. The implicit logic of the policy was that it was important to protect Canadians from exposure to COVID-19 imported by temporary foreign workers, but less attention was paid to protecting temporary foreign workers and other marginalized groups of essential workers from exposures at work, in the community, and in housing. Temporary foreign workers and interjurisdictional workers who live at or near their workplaces are potentially exposed to COVID-19 in all of these places, as shown by widespread and serious outbreaks in many work camps, on many farms, and in workplaces like meat processing plants. From a governance perspective, while temporary foreign workers were technically, although not always, entitled to similar employment standards and health and safety protections and social benefits as resident workers, they're by no means always protected or able to take up their rights. As you've noted, Melissa, there's substantial and growing reliance on temporary foreign workers in Atlantic Canada's seafood processing sector, and an unknown level of reliance on them in fishing in Atlantic Canada. This reliance may well increase in the future due to aging labor forces, low wages, and employment uncertainty in both fishing and seafood processing. Melissa, you and others have written about the vulnerabilities and marginalization of temporary foreign workers in previous work, but you've also written about the agency of some in a recent piece on flagpoling. Temporary foreign workers in agriculture in Canada and the organizations and researchers working with them have showed clear agency as they've fought for recognition of abuse and vulnerability and enhanced rights for these workers, but that work becoming more visible during COVID. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about your work on flagpoling. I'd also be interested in your thoughts about priorities for future research on industrial workers in North Atlantic fisheries and aquaculture. Thanks. Over to you, Desai.
Okay, thank you so much, Barb. And thank you so much, Melissa and Peter, for sharing this very important recent research with us. And this study, in my opinion, on maritime labor conventions in the international deep sea fishing sector has contributed very important knowledge to our understanding of health and safety, as well as the humanitarian crisis that has occurred during the pandemic. So it's not just the fishing, not just, I would say, not just shipping, but all basically a huge maritime humanitarian and occupational health and safety crisis at sea. So basically the deep reason, or the deep cause, one of the deep causes behind this crisis is that the lack of well-coordinated maritime governance among flag states, port states, labor supply states, and the states of ship owners. So basically, Melissa and Peter's study drawing upon a comparative analysis with merchant seafarers. So basically you use merchant seafarers maritime labor convention as a better standard, but actually we can see that there are weaknesses in both fishing and merchant maritime labor governance. So the weakness existed, including international conventions, national labor standards, and port state inspection. So it's a multi-layers weakness, multi-layers loopholes need to be filled. The lack of coordinated protection of fishing workers among flag states, port states, I would say the major reason why maritime workers, including seafarers and fishers, cannot access sufficient legal protection from flag states. And port states, because in particular, let's say in the shipping industry, we can see the development is first from safety of vessel, environmental protection, and later on is maritime labor. While fishing vessels in the shipping perspective, not going to cause huge oil pollution for the port states, then there is a very weak interest of the port states, coast states to put in to invest more resources to improve maritime labor standards on board fishing vessels. So similarly, in their home states, it seems to be a job opportunities. For example, for long-term in China, in the Philippines, to compete for the job opportunity in the international maritime labor market, including shipping and fishing, is quite a more important thing compared to protect labor. And to reduce or to decrease labor standards, decrease social security, being viewed as a competitive advantage of these labor supply states. So all these factors contributed to the extended service periods at sea, in some cases over years. So as Melissa mentioned, over 3 years, or even they have strong intention to extend the service, and being abused by captains on board, extremely long working hours, poor living conditions, poor food choices, being exposed to a lot of occupational hazards, such as noise and infection risks of a variety of infectious disease, not limited just to COVID-19. And we also did another parallel research on merchant seafarers during the pandemic, which I would say could be more like a sister study with Peter and Melissa's study. So drawing upon 29 semi-structured interviews with seafarers, ship managers, key informants from maritime authorities and maritime charities, so which also the port chaplains. So you could also call them maritime welfare professionals as per the Maritime Labor Convention. So we have explored the health and safety challenges faced by seafarers during the extended service at sea and impacts of public health measures, including quarantine, self-isolation on seafarers' welfare. So merchant seafarers also facing similar crew exchange crisis, inability to take shore leaves. So one seafarer interviewee on Monday sent me a message, and he told me that he was finally, eventually in the airport and could be repatriated after 2 years service. And this is not uncommon, and his colleagues stayed on board for more than 2.5 years and approaching 3 years. So they were Chinese seafarers, Chinese international seafarers working on board vessels operating in Thailand. So basically, it's a global seafarers crisis. And although International Maritime Organization, International Labor Organization, and the United Nations have made considerable efforts to urge sovereign states to designate fishing seafarers and merchant seafarers key worker status and exempt them from travel restrictions, most seafarers, both in the fishing industry and the shipping industry, still cannot be repatriated, and they face tremendous difficulties to access medical care in port. Even in the case is fatal. So IMO, International Maritime Organization, even report that seafarers experience symptoms of stroke, need urgent medical care, being denied medical access in the port states. So we're facing a real humanitarian crisis. In Canada, Transport Canada allows international seafarers to take shore leave, controlled shore leave, according to Transport Canada, which means up to 4 hours to seek some medical care. But we can see that captains, management companies, and ship owners would not allow their seafarers to take shore leave, even in Canada, where the port states allow them to do so. So we now read a lot of news about inflation, interrupted supply chains, increased ocean freight. So behind the crisis of the supply chain, actually what we have is a humanitarian crisis behind the supply chain crisis. So if there is a lot of demand to sustain the trade, but very few resources, limited resources to support the essential workers, the key workers, maintain the supply chains in fishing and shipping sector. So Melissa mentioned that Canada has not ratified Say 188. So why? Why not? Why? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? Why Canada not ratify that? So the first challenge we identify through a recent study is that the fragmented jurisdictions among Canadian federal and provincial authorities. So the fragmented fishing health and safety governance due to the division of powers between federal and provincial governance has led to the Canadian fishing governance also in a very unpredictable, fragmented, inconsistent area. So we had that discussion with the Transport Canada at the Canadian Maritime Advisory Council. But when talking about fishing, whether it should be provincial or whether that should be federal jurisdiction, always have the debate. So you could see the debate all the time. So if we take Atlantic Canadian fishing workers as example, we can find that they are not subject to equal and equitable protection. So Newfoundland and Labrador fishing harvesters, fishing workers have workers' compensation coverage during the fishing season. But when off the season, which is also when they need to do repairs, which is also a major part of their fishing work, they are not protected by the workers' compensation schemes. So fishing workers from PEI and New Brunswick currently are still not covered by the compulsory workers' compensation. So it's optional for the fishing vessel owner or the fishing enterprise to choose or not to cover their fishing workers. So to enhance and equalize the workers' compensation coverage among Canadian fishing seafarers, I would say is also the first step Canada needs to do to enhance our Canadian maritime governance and to contribute to the equitable ocean governance and blue economy. Also, international fishing harvesters discussed by Melissa is not out of sight, out of mind in Atlantic Canada. And in one of our another research on the maritime welfare study in St. John's, we learned from the local ship agents that Japanese and Indonesian fishing seafarers visit St. John's frequently, and they desperately need port-based welfare services. As Melissa mentioned, Wi-Fi or a SIM card helps them to communicate with their families, will make significant changes or significant improvement for their welfare, for their mental health. So basically, the community supports to seek medical health service in St. John's. We have 2 or 3 outbreaks on fishing vessels, Portugal fishing vessels, COVID-19 outbreaks on board. So we have strong community supports, but we also need a dedicated maritime welfare service center in St. John's to help both Canadian seafarers, international seafarers in fishing sector and merchant shipping sector. So that's basically my reflexive thoughts about Melissa and Peter's study. So I have 2 questions for Melissa and Peter, if Peter could answer. And the first one is that to address this humanitarian crisis at sea in the fishing sector, so what would be the short strategy you will recommend Canada as a port state and flag state to help to address the problem? Secondly, we also learned from the news in May 2021 this year that United States, the Customs and Border Protection issued a ban on seafood imports from a Chinese fishing enterprise due to the accusation that their fleet used forced labor. Do you think that Canada should also adopt a similar strategy? So what would be the advantage and disadvantage of using a trade sanctions to improve labor standards at sea? So that's basically my 2 questions. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thanks, Desai. So for now, we'll have 5 or so minutes for Melissa and Peter to converse with Desai and Barb's questions. Barb set up a question as well as Desai's couple.
Thank you both. Really stimulating comments, and so valuable to hear more about what's been happening for seafarers in Atlantic Canada, both fish workers and cargo workers. I think I'll pick up on one of each of your points, and I'd be curious what you would say. Barb, you asked about agency of workers, and I think it's true. These are really difficult working conditions. I completely agree that it's a humanitarian crisis often that workers are facing, and yet we find these incredible examples of people navigating the system to manage things more easily. So in the case of workers as part of the temporary foreign worker program, Christine Knott and I wrote a paper about flagpoling. I have to give her credit. She really drove this. She heard me present some of our work and started chatting with me about this. What we saw in our data was that particularly Filipino workers who could easily navigate the internet, they had figured out a way to avoid those labor broker and lawyer fees that I was speaking of. And so if you can get a new work permit, if you can organize that with a company, it often takes a long time for all that paperwork to come through. And one way that migrant workers have found a great loophole, I would argue, is to go to leave Canada and re-enter. So it's called flag pulling, literally to go around the flag. And so you leave Canada at the border and you re-enter to have your new work permit validated. And that saves a huge amount of money for workers, also for companies, but also a huge amount of time. So it's not just money, it's time, because it's so slow if it's getting processed in Ottawa. So that's been one piece that we found a few workers have figured out, but it takes a really strong sense of navigating the internet, figuring out the loophole, confidence that it will work. So not all workers can actually do this. And in a way, it's a shame more companies, seafood companies, haven't kind of figured it out, rather than always encouraging workers to go through a lawyer to change jobs and pay those fees. So one of the areas I've been really concerned about from the limited research I've done out east is the that workers are paying not only to get jobs, but to change jobs. And so flagpoling is a great loophole around this, and something that I think needs more attention. My other comment would be about, I'm actually in shock that there's not a Seafarer Center in St. John's. I guess I hadn't thought about it, but that just seems to be so obvious. It's not hard to support an NGO to advocate on behalf of seafarers, whether it's in fishing or cargo. It's kind of a no-brainer to me. So I think that makes huge sense to advocate for at a minimum in the short term. You asked about the US State Department and how they've been able to use trade sanctions to ban boats. I do think this can be really powerful, and you see that Taiwan in particular has really quickly cleaned up their act, and because of such trade sanctions. My worry about these kind of one-off naming and shaming of boats is what if you have it wrong? So if it's really clear that labor abuse has taken place, yes, of course. But in some cases, it's through one report that a boat will be named and shamed, and the due diligence hasn't been given to really figure out what's going on for workers. And so that can be the risk with that kind of strategy. But at a minimum, Canada needs a strategy to deal with labor abuse across sectors. We've focused a bit on China and Uyghurs. Seafood gets mentioned, but we don't have any policy in place. We're quite slow on the uptake of, I think right now we're calling it a Modern Slavery Act. It's like Bill C, I can't remember, but it's not, it keeps getting dropped, and there's no office, and it's not actively housed. So we clearly need to get our act together on a policy piece.
Can I just pick, Paul, I don't know when you want to go to Q&A, but I only see one question, so maybe I can.
Yeah, I think we have
going.
time to keep this conversation going,
Sure.
and then we'll move to
Okay.
Q&A. Yep.
Yeah, so I thanks, Melissa. On the flagpoling study, which is I think a really interesting study. I mean, it is worth reflecting. You already are indicating in that paper that basically what was happening there was the shifting of responsibility and tasks from immigration over to the Canadian Border Services Agency, and the Canadian Border Services Agency wasn't very happy about this and was starting to move in the direction of constraining this kind of activity and so on. So again, you've got this fragmentation of jurisdiction and bodies that are maybe attuned to human rights issues, and others that are not attuned to human rights issues, or attuned to immigration law, or not attuned to that kind of law. And I think that one of the reflections would be, well, what did COVID-19 do to that option? And, why is that option important? And I think, the literature on temporary foreign workers has emphasized very strongly the fact that unlike Canadian residents, the people who are resident in Canada, temporary foreign workers are almost always tied to particular employers. Not always, it depends on the category. And it's that being tied to a particular employer that is a major source of vulnerability. It makes them a form of unfree labor in a sense. So if I take a job and I'm abused in that job, then I can walk, right? I can, I may not be able to walk if I don't feel like I can find another job. But the point is, I'm not constrained to stay there or forced to go home and probably pay my own way home. And so what flagpoling did, and some of the other research that's happened, some of it through On the Move, has shown is that temporary foreign workers have been changing employers to some degree. And this is one of the means by which they've been able to do that. And they do it often in order to try to improve their chances of immigration. They want to immigrate. And we're looking at growing reliance on temporary foreign workers in fish processing and in fishing, potentially in Atlantic Canada. And we see it in agriculture, and workers come back for decades to the same employer, this is not a temporary labor force. This is actually a permanent labor force. And so the question then becomes, well, why are they not allowed to immigrate? Because if they're allowed to immigrate, then they will have the same rights as Canadian workers or workers who are resident in Canada. And the effect of not being able to immigrate and the tied unfree labor that this system creates is that it keeps wages low. And it also creates competition because they work alongside of workers who are resident in Canada. And we can see this in other research that's been done. The dynamics of a workplace where you have local employees, migrant, interprovincial migrant Canadian employees from Newfoundland going to other provinces, working alongside of temporary foreign workers, and how the dynamics of how that plays out, in part because they essentially have different rights.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think for me, because all of our work had initially been with migrant workers on offshore boats or nearshore boats, but overseas, it's been enlightening to think about the challenges we have here in Canada and the racism that migrant workers face and the limitations of our own programs here as well.
Okay, great. Desai, did you have any reflections, or should we move to the Q&A? And we can always come back to this as well if there's time.
Yeah, just maybe another thought about the temporary foreign workers or migrant workers. So in the maritime sector, because working in the confined, isolated environment, or we can call that from a sociological perspective as a total institution. So the lack of freedom has another layer, not just legally, but also physically. And also Melissa mentioned in the discussion that unlike seafarers, merchant seafarers, cargo seafarers, fishing seafarers not attract much media coverage. Actually, I noticed the Wine News reported by Guardian, the Indonesian seafarer being kind of suffering violence on board a fishing boat and then being killed or died on board. And the captain decided to use sea funeral to dump the body into the sea. And the Indonesian government requested Chinese Ministry of Affairs to investigate the accident and to give an answer for this accident, to explain what happened on board. But later on, we can see that become a political issue between China, United States, and Indonesia. So how sometimes it's very challenging for us to take labor rights, depoliticalized it, and back to the labor rights, sustainable development, equitable and eco ocean economy development, rather than sometimes politicize those problems. And then we are not going to solve it. We are not going to make any progress. So temporary foreign worker, migrant workers, and particular, let's say, seafarers in fishing sector, in merchant shipping sector, they are facing huge challenges when we need to make any progress to improve their labor conditions. So that's basically some of my another 2 cents thoughts to this discussion. Yeah.
Wonderful, Desai. We have about 22 minutes for the Q&A session to open it up. We have one current question I can start off with, and others might follow as we get going. But I'll pose this. It looks like it's from Ajith Raj, who says, great talk, very insightful, Melissa and others. The Asia Floor Wage is one platform which works in South Asia to protect labor rights against highly mobile capital in garment workers. And 2 questions related to that. First, do we have any similar counter labor movements at regional scales in Southeast Asia context for fish workers to safeguard basic rights? And also, what is the response of the governments in countries like Indonesia or Vietnam, from where most labor supply occur? Thanks.
Thank you. You know, we don't have an Asia floor wage when it comes to fish work. It still seems to be regulated per fleet. And so what we're hearing is there's different pay rates per month, depending on which fleet you're on. So the Chinese fleet paying the least, around $300 a month, the Taiwanese fleet paying $450 and then kind of up to $800 or $900 if you're, say, on a Spanish fleet per month. So key for workers, they know that the rate is different depending on what boat you're on. And so they're trying to negotiating to get on different boats, or in many cases to actually get out of fishing and get into cargo, which pays better generally. The recruiting agencies back in the Philippines or Indonesia who are trying to supply workers, often they're the ones that are saying, well, we can't fill, crew on the Chinese boat, or you have to first do a stint in fish working before you can move into cargo. And so they're often, because they're kind of getting quotas that they want to fill, they're kind of forcing that entry level. And so the negotiation takes a while to happen. But in terms of a global platform or even a regional platform where there would be a minimum, no, that just doesn't exist on industrial fishing. It's really determined per country. So per Taiwan, per China, where the global fleets are based. In terms of the response of governments in countries like Indonesia or the Philippines or Vietnam, there has been there is a growing amount of advocacy, particularly in the Philippines and Indonesia. And we've been talking with these organizations in the last year. So it's growing. In the last 3 or 4 years, that advocacy work is really, really growing. At the same time, it's been really surprising that consular services don't exist in many major ports. Maybe there's a few more consular services in terms for Filipino workers, but not for many other workers, including for the Vietnamese, for example. So at port, globally, you're relying on diaspora communities mainly and advocacy from back home. So there's definitely a governance role where these sending countries have to insist on better labor standards, but I'd also argue they have to manage their own recruiting agencies, which is currently not well managed from what we understand.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks so much. We have another question. So this is from Furkan Asif, who asks, the findings here are super important. Thanks to Melissa and the discussants for sharing their thoughts. Given the clear gaps in terms of protections and governance, has there been uptake or engagement with Canadian government at provincial or federal levels to inform policy? Sounds like quite the governance challenge. Thanks. And I think we've touched on some of that. So I welcome the discussions as well to join in after Melissa, if you have thoughts, Melissa.
Yeah, I think both Desai and Barb know far more about the Canadian scene, which is great. Actually, it's not something I understand particularly well. I've been more trying to follow due diligence legislation, which would be for forced labor in seafood, but also forced labor in tomatoes, or across commodities. And I've been trying to follow that because I've been really surprised we don't have that type of legislation. Australia's got something. As I said, France is incredibly progressive, their due diligence legislation, and it could be seen as a model. But this stuff has been around for 4 or 5 years, and so I'm surprised the Liberal government hasn't prioritized it. As Desai mentioned, I don't know why we haven't signed C188. She might have some, she gave us some insights as to why that hasn't happened. And then in terms of our temporary foreign worker program, we also need better governance, but it's quite piecemeal across jurisdictions, and it's difficult to do research on this stuff. And so it seems to be hard to move the policy needle, but Barbara Desai may have more to say on that.
Okay, so I think I probably will add another thought about this. So thanks about this question. So basically, in terms of governance, we all know fishing governance is a wicked problem. So it's like basically, if we're talking about fishing governance or maritime governance, we have technical aspects related to fishing vessels and gears. And then we have the training training standards of the fishing seafarers and workers on board. And then we have labor conditions. And then we also need to consider about the quota. We also need to consider about the environment protection or conservation of the fishing resources. So actually, when talking about health and safety or labor standards, it's not a separate or independent component. There are other policies affect. So for example, quota and competitive fishing will affect the ship owner, employers, enterprise, and the fishing harvester, their behaviors. So why they take risks, why they are more likely to accept a lower labor standards. So it's more about this being kind of constructed in this fishing economy. So that's why in Canada, I would say, we're now basically put blue economy as a strategy or ocean economy as a strategy. We need a better integrated governance between federal and provincial. And also TSB, so Transportation Safety Board, investigate fishing vessel accident and provided a lot of recommendations and to ask for a better coordination collaboration between the provincial level and federal level. So that we need to make it happen, not just leave it at the TSB recommendations, or just saying that we have some recommended or voluntary schemes, rather than to make efforts to improve the labor standards, the health and safety standards, and after a comprehensive review of all related fishing policies. That's basically Canada as a flag states need to make efforts to. Secondly, as the port states, so similarly with the merchant shipping, so port-based welfare services, port-based labor supports, so let's say inspection. So in say 188, in the future, there will be a port state inspection, but it's not very, I would say, need to be further developed. So it's not as, even though I have strong criticism for the merchant shipping port state inspection. So compared to the fishing, so basically there are still lessons could basically the fishing port state inspection to be improved. So that first need to have a protocol, have a mechanism, have a designated authority to do that inspection. And then we also talking about trade sanctions. So that's trying to have a responsible supply chains, responsible fishing, responsible supply chain, responsible seafood products, socially responsible. So that's basically my thoughts about this question. Thank you.
And I can see we've got more questions, Paul. So I think just quickly, I think there really has not been a lot of attention paid to the shift towards temporary foreign workers in fisheries in Canada. That's nothing like what we've had happen in terms of agriculture. I think we do need a lot of research there. And I think that we need to, that we are at a kind of critical point, at least in Atlantic Canada. And so looking at the history in agriculture, I think would be very, very useful. And then starting to map that onto in terms of where we are in that trajectory within the region, and then what are the alternatives and so on. But we tend to get a very blunt, we have a labor shortage, therefore we have to go to temporary foreign workers. And that's just a complete failure of understanding the complexity of those processes. So if you're going to, but now is the time, in fact, to develop a policy pamphlet or discussion around this to try and position us as we move forward to have a fair and equitable and healthy sustainable future labor force that doesn't rely on these kinds of divisions. But I'm going to turn you over to the other questions through Paul.
Yeah, we have two more questions, and one can probably link to the discussion just now, but and Desai, you did mention in your reflections just now about the blue economy, that governments like Canada are engaging that concept. So we have one question, about is there an opportunity to bring labor into blue economy debates? We might even flip it to say, is the blue economy an opportunity to get the issues around labor addressed? And I know even countries, around the world are taking up the blue economy flag and going with it in places like India and other places. So do you see any potential there to anybody?
Desai may have more to say than I. I'm a little critical of the blue economy framework. I've been thinking more in terms of blue justice. I don't think the blue economy thinks very carefully about labor myself, but others might have more to say about that. In general, thinking carefully about labor, working conditions, people's basic human rights in those processes seems to get left off the table in many of these discussions.
Yeah, and I agree with Melissa. I think the labor, or let's say the human component of the blue economy need to be enhanced. There are also some optimism signs. So I would also like to share a little bit during the COVID-19, because, for example, let's say International Maritime Governance Institution, International Maritime Organization, for a long period of time, IMO restrain themselves in technical safety, environmental protection, and avoid to touch any labor issues. Well, during the pandemic, IMO, now they even have a task force to support maritime workers, including both merchant seafarers and fishing seafarers. If they have urgent need, they can email IMO. So that, I would say, a step made a very important step for a blue economy to consider to cover labor issues, because previously for a long time it's become a political part. As I mentioned, I would like to say it's depoliticized of this labor issues in the ocean economy. So basically we need the ocean economy to contribute to improve labor standards, to improve human rights, rather than to become another scandal or humanitarian crisis at sea. So we can see some efforts being made. There would be an opportunity, but there's also another challenge. So we have the automation, autonomous vessels. So we have heard this kind of a sound already in the industry, and to eliminate labor from ocean economy, or to eliminate traditional employment opportunities. So it seems to be labor component in the blue economy facing challenges, not just from the working conditions, but also from the technology or technocracy of the blue economy. So it's a very difficult, I would say a difficult scenario, how to place human and labor in the blue economy and try to avoid being into the trap of technocracy or being in the trap of a political dispute between sovereign states.
Thank you, Desai. So we have another question. This one's from Christine Knott, and I think it's directed to Melissa or the panelists, and I'm not sure if Peter has been able to connect Melissa. But this is from Christine. Excellent presentation and discussion. Have you considered mapping not just the fishing routes, but also the routes that migrant workers are taking to get to ports or boats, to compare and contrast? And also, you touched on the marginalization of migrant workers within seafaring governance. How does this also reflect the marginalization and racialization of migrant workers themselves in terms of where they are coming from and why?
Thanks, Christine. I should say Christine was the co-author on our flag polling paper. I think I mentioned that. And so, yeah, this is a great question. Yes, we've absolutely been actually following the migrant worker routes as well. It's quite within, whether it's Vietnam or Indonesia or the Philippines, it's quite dispersed where workers are coming from, but they all kind of end up at a particular port where they will then take a boat or be flown to various ports globally. And so that's great feedback on actually thinking about a map, particularly now that we're understanding that some workers are going directly to Singapore or to South Africa, and they're bypassing sort of the first 10 days or 40 days on a boat. And so, yeah, that's great to think about mapping that piece out as well to see when they're joining particular fishing routes. So yes, we have been looking at that. In terms of marginalization, yeah, workers in fishing are often marginalized for several reasons. In some cases, if they've come from an agrarian background, such as in Indonesia, climate shifts have forced them out of farming, or they might be in fishing and it's just hard to make enough money. And so often it's economic marginalization that's driving them for other opportunities. And even on the worst case scenario of the Chinese fleet, it's still more money than you'd make at home. And so it's young workers that can take the risk. In some cases are looking for adventure, but generally are being driven by poverty back home. So there's different pockets depending on the country of where workers are coming from. There is something tied to ethnicity as well, but it depends very much on the country as to how that trend might be, how prevalent that trend might be. Because in a few cases, fish workers make it and they actually are paid and they get what they're owed and they can return and remit. There is the potential that it can work out. And so the challenge is that not all cases work out. And so this is where it's very patchy in terms of the end result, but certainly in terms of continuously driving a body of workers into sea work, companies are not having a problem finding recruits at this point because of what's going on in sending countries.
Thanks so much. We're just about at time, so I'll maybe ask the presenters and discussants if there are any final reflections, a minute or so each, or if I'll leave it up to you if you want to contribute. Final thoughts.
Hi, Paul. I've got just a couple of thoughts. I'm interested in the demographics of this labor force that you just articulated. I mean, obviously you've got racialization, but you've also got, are they coming from agriculture? Where are they coming from? Are they young? Are they older workers? And I mean, I know in the case of the temporary foreign worker program in Canada, they have often tried to recruit married people with children because they want them to go home again, right? That it's in it, and also because, you know, that's seen as kind of driving a dependable labor force. So, and that takes me to my second point, which is that I'd strongly recommend people taking a look at some of Sarah DeRoe's work on the oil or the tar sands in Alberta and what she calls the mobility regimes. So that she analyzes basically the quite deliberate strategies of managing mobility as part of a kind of labor management strategy. So, you know, you pay for travel at certain points, you stop paying it at other points. The rotational structure is feasible for some workers and not for, there are many ways in which available labor supplies can be manipulated. And again, there are some people that have more or less flexibility in that environment. So skilled Red Seal workers are probably always going to have their travel paid. Laborers are not going to have their travel paid. You know, the skilled Red Seal worker could change job if they don't like the rotational change. Other workers can't, right? And so on. So that I think part of the point of our work is that this is a key part of labor management and employer labor relations, if you like, or recruitment agency worker relations, that has really maybe been looked at somewhat with temporary foreign workers and international labor migrants, but I think really needs to be looked at in a much more conscious and explicit way as we look at how these things work themselves out.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I think
Barb.
that's a great point. And, you know, we talk about the race to the bottom in terms of fishing, but there's a race to the bottom in terms of the cheapest body that can go on these boats. And so we've seen a shift from the Philippines was a major recruiting area for fish workers. We know there's far more Indonesians now. There's less port-based organizations that would speak Bahasa or for workers to have access to MOCs or to take into account dietary restrictions. And so these workers are are definitely being even more marginalized. Will more Burmese workers end up on these international fleets, again, not having language skills? So this is definitely an area we have to watch, because for companies, there is a strong interest to keep costs down. And this is exactly the trend we have to fight against, so that workers have fair pay and better rights and health and safety.
All right, I'd like to, just looking at the time, and I know we're losing some people already, I'd like to encourage participants to actually reach out to the presenters and discussants. We've started a really great discussion, and I hope it continues offline. And I'd like to also remind everyone of today's webinar is actually a part of the OFI People in the Ocean speaker series, and there will be more of these in the new year, so please stay tuned. And finally, I would like to really thank again our panelists, Melissa and Peter, and discussants Desai and Barb, for an incredibly rich and important discussion about seafarers who are, thanks to their research and researchers like them, coming out of the shadows of globalization and the global pandemic. So thanks so much, and I hope to see everyone in the new year. Take care.